Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. As promised, here is part 2 of my Last of Us cut content. Today we'll be covering The Last of Us Part 2 and some of its cut content. Similar to last week's video, we'll be looking at the art book for a lot of information because that's really where I've been able to find the most information. I will say though, they went into this game with a much clearer vision of what it was going to be. With The Last of Us Part 1, we had a lot of very different designs and very different story beats all together that would have really changed how the game flowed. However, it seems with Part 2 they really had things ironed out because a lot of the world building had already been done in the previous one. But that's not to say that there isn't a lot of very interesting stuff to be found in this. So, without further ado, let's get started. First, let's start with some information we can find in the art book. It's fairly well known that the sort of open world section of The Last of Us Part 2, the Seattle Day 1 portion, was actually meant to be a lot larger. This is something I've heard in videos that discuss the development of The Last of Us Part 2, as well as in this art book. We can find images of how much more open the Seattle sections were meant to be, and the Space Needle was actually meant to be featured a lot more heavily. Dogs are a new enemy type that was introduced in The Last of Us Part 2. Most of the time you can find WLF groups having at least 1 or 2 dogs that answer to one wrangler. The difficult thing about them is that they can sniff you out, so even if you're hiding out of sight, they can still track you down. This would have been much more difficult with this early version of the dog wrangler, or of the dog keeper, whatever you want to call them, because they would have had 4 dogs to them. Speaking of dogs, we see the return of the lost dog companion that I mentioned in my previous video. If you're unfamiliar, number one, I recommend going on my channel and watching my Last of Us Part 1 cut content, but just to bring you up to speed, there was originally going to be a dog companion for Ellie in the section where she's taking care of Joel while he's sort of sick and recovering from being stabbed. And interestingly enough, in Part 2, there was once again supposed to be a dog companion for Ellie. One version had this dog showing up in a flashback with Tommy and Ellie, presumably when they are practicing shooting at the infected. The other part where the dog was supposed to appear would be towards the end of the game at Ellie and Dina's farm. Both dogs are different breeds, so it would have been 2 different dogs throughout Ellie's life, but it's still interesting that throughout the series, they've considered having a dog companion. And I wonder if this dog would have come with us to Santa Barbara, considering that Ellie doesn't have anyone to help out during that section. Ultimately, it was cut in both versions, this flashback as well as the Santa Barbara section / her farm. This dog also would have played a role in a cut hunting quest for Ellie where she would go out and hunt a boar before then returning to the farm, and then the scene plays out like we see in the game. But going back to the flashbacks, it seems that the Joel and Ellie confrontation that in the game takes place outside of the Salt Lake City hospital would have actually taken place inside. The two would have been arguing surrounded by the long rotted corpses of the dead fireflies that Joel killed. It really highlights the brutality of this game, that they are literally surrounded by the bodies, the consequences of Joel's actions. And speaking of the game being brutal, there are many things throughout the art book that are way more brutal than what we ended up getting, which is saying a lot, especially with The Last of Us Part 2. When Ellie finds Mel and Owen, she ends up sort of killing them in the heat of the moment when she's trying to interrogate them. It seems like the sort of tension took over and it wasn't really a calculated thing, and she instantly regrets it, especially when she finds out that Mel is pregnant. In an early version, in some concept art, we can see that Ellie would have been much more sadistic with this killing. We see that Mel is on the ground, basically begging for mercy, while Ellie points a gun to her. It makes me wonder if once they, refuse to give up Abby, that she just borderline executes Mel. The WLF are held up in what in real life I would assume is the Seattle Seahawks football stadium. I forget the fictional name of it, but we get a pretty nice tour of the entire area, and all the artwork is pretty one-to-one with what we get in the game. But one of the things we don't see, and that would eventually be turned into a combat section, is this sort of shipping yard. In it you can see WLF soldiers, as well as other people moving crates, loading things up, and it's possible that they have fixed up the railway system and are using it between their outposts. However, this sort of train yard area would eventually be turned into a combat section for Abby. On the other side of the conflict in Seattle, we have the Seraphites, who were originally designed to be a fishing-oriented community. What this means is that a lot of their gear, a lot of their outfits were fishing-oriented. They were seen having nets, ponchos, even gas masks, and in this artwork you can also see that they're holding guns. It appears that in this early version they weren't so anti-technology. The other interesting thing is that we would have seen them actively scarring someone. And there's also different variations of what the scar design would end up being. There's some that are on the forehead and in different parts of the face, rather than the sort of smile scars that we end up getting. The other thing is it appears that there would have been an enemy type on horseback that we would have had to fight. However, this was ultimately cut and moved to the scripted section where Abby is on the Scar Island. The aquarium / marina is a very, very interesting place in The Last of Us Part 2. It's a place that holds a lot of memories for Abby and Owen. And it's sort of a safe hub. You know, it's where a lot of the drama takes place, but there's never any real combat, unless you count the Nerf bow and arrow target section. However, it appears that early on, you would have had to fight off infected inside of the marina. That they would have somehow broken in, and you can see it's in that sort of tube section where they've got the fish around it, and they're flooding it, and Abby's firing a gun at them. I think that's very interesting that this sort of safe environment is being invaded by infected. Another interesting thing about the sort of later sections of the game with Ellie, where she's on the farm, is that initially Maria was the one who would be telling Ellie where Abby was located before Ellie leaves Dina. Why that's interesting to me is because that means that Tommy most likely died. As we know, he doesn't die in the final game, and somehow, even though he has what I'm assuming is severe brain trauma, he manages to survive, and they, carry him all the way back to Jackson, but that's besides the point. In this early version, like I said, Maria would be the one telling them. However, I feel like even if Tommy died, I don't see her doing that. And it might be something that they do in the TV show, but even then, I don't feel like just because Tommy dies, I don't think she would suddenly want revenge herself. I think to her, Tommy dying would prove, hey, we can't do this. You've lost enough. I've lost enough. That kind of thing. Now we're going to get into more specific character design details. And we're going to start with Dina. Dina overall looks the same. The biggest difference being the weapons that she carries with her, and I guess some of her early designs. It appears that early on she had a bit more of like a guerrilla fighter sort of look, with a headband and other things. The other interesting thing is her choice of firearm. It looks like initially she had some sort of AK type rifle, which is funny to imagine somebody with a burst or like a fully automatic gun in The Last of Us. Even Abby's rifle isn't, it's a single fire. Now I guess Ellie's little silenced SMG is an example of that, but even then. Now we're going to talk about Abby's character design. Originally, Abby was a lot more slim. She looked like Ellie, and according to interviews I've read, she was supposed to play like her as well. And it appears that her main weapon, her main melee weapon, I guess, would have been a machete, as she's seen in several pieces of artwork holding this machete or being shown actively using. However, people higher in Naughty Dog wanted Abby to play more like Joel. Because we would be losing Joel, having two stealth-only characters who play the same, they were concerned about people thinking that they sort of just copy and pasted Ellie. And I get from a story perspective why they wanted her to be similar, so it would really emphasize that these people are two sides of the same coin. However, because of this note from the executives, they decided to build her up and have her play in a much more brute, combat-oriented way. In early designs of Ellie in the Santa Barbara section, she's actually seen using the same machete or a similar one to Abby, so it kind of shows you the interesting way that ideas can sort of start in one place, get scrapped, and sort of work their way back around to another. And finally, we're going to briefly talk about the infected. In my previous video, I talked about how the infected design was originally a lot different, that over time, more and more fungus would build up and cause the infected to hunch and hunch and hunch until eventually they would fall into the ground and become one of those big piles of spores and fungus that we see in certain buildings. However, the design was ultimately changed for the sort of sprouting upward clicker type design that we see. The Last of Us 2 introduces an enemy type called the Shambler. The Shambler is a lot different than like a normal brute. In its early designs, see a return of that philosophy from part 1. And what I mean by that is in initial designs of the Shambler, it looks a lot like early versions of Infected from part 1. And I just thought that was interesting that they were reworking that back in there. Now, let's get into some of the early story differences. One of the biggest differences that I think would have changed a lot about Joel. Joel was originally supposed to have a girlfriend/wife. Her name was Esther. Esther is another hardworking member of the community of Jackson, and apparently Tommy would be the one to set up Joel and Esther. Originally, the player would have met Esther in a flashback about 6 or 7 hours into the game. This flashback would ultimately be turned into the sequence with Tommy and Ellie together. Esther would have lived slightly outside of the community of Jackson, about 2 hours away according to some people who worked on the game. She would live closer to the dams. Once Joel and Ellie made it out to the house, they would find that Infected had broken in. Once inside, they would find Esther, who is bitten, desperately trying to apply a tourniquet. Esther knew she was gonna die. She was just trying to kind of set herself up so she could maybe write a note, do whatever she needed to do before it was time. She wasn't like in denial or anything. Understanding the urgency and what she was trying to do, Joel would send Ellie to go get Esther some water from a nearby river. Ellie would leave, and then we would hear a bang from inside the house. After a little bit of time, they most likely discussed what they needed to do, and it's sort of left up to interpretation whether it was Joel or Esther who pulled the trigger. Haley Gross, who worked on the game, would say, "It was two adults who were making a decision, and they were going to try to protect Ellie as much as they could." But ultimately, Esther was scrapped due to the fact that they just couldn't establish her. They felt they couldn't properly set her up, and that her character taking up time would sort of pull away from Ellie's journey and build on Joel's, who they felt was mostly complete to this point. And they said even towards the end of the game, there was a love letter to Joel in his house that you could find. However, that was removed from the final product. As I mentioned, Seattle was meant to be much, much larger and much more open. And instead of 3 days, Ellie would have been traveling around for 5. And within this time, Ellie would have gotten to the Scar Island and traversed it before the final battle and the final confrontation that we see from Abby's perspective. The purpose was to humanize the Scars earlier on, rather than just having Lev and Yara to do it. It was meant to show what life was really like on the island before, having to take up arms against the WLF. You would have seen Seraphite families. You would have shown that despite their flaws and despite the outdated beliefs that they hold, that they were still people at the end of the day who wanted to live their life. However, they ultimately cut it because they felt it just took up time and that it really didn't add anything for Ellie, and this was something that would be more important for Abby to see. And they also couldn't really swing it to work in that way. When you go on the island as Abby, even before the fight breaks out, they're still on edge. In the dance section where Dina kisses Ellie, and then Ellie gets confronted by the homophobic guy, Seth, and then Joel steps up and they argue, and then eventually Ellie goes off and talks to Joel and they sort of settle things. It was actually meant to be a much larger party. Unused animations of Ellie pretending to be a clicker in order to scare kids was found, as well as multiple animations for Ellie getting drinks, meeting with people, talking with people. It's all very interesting. It would have been a much bigger section. There was a cut sewer section where Ellie in the river would end up falling into this sort of maze-like sewer section where she'd have to fight off stalkers and things like that. That was ultimately cut because they felt it just didn't really add anything to the story. It was just kind of padding. This was once again back when there were 5 days in Seattle rather than just the 3 that we ended up with. Finally, the most interesting thing is the way that Abby confronts Joel. there's a few different variations. At one point in time, it appears that Abby's group manages to get inside of Jackson and corner Joel that way. They sort of work their way inside of the community and then corner him and confront him. The other interesting thing is just the various ways that Joel would have died in this early version. When Abby was much more like Ellie and had this machete, there's concept art that shows Joel's hand being cut off, still holding a gun, and Abby pointing the machete at him. Basically meaning that this would have been a much more heat of the moment, I'm quickly going to cut off his hand and then I'm going to, take my time and kill him that way. And it appears that no one else in the group is around. This could have been in the version where she sneaks into the community and sort of gets close and then corners him and kills him. Another version shows that the torture was going to be much longer and that more of the group was going to be involved. And I say that because there's a knife handle sticking out of him, he's still being bludgeoned, and that maybe more of the group would get their licks in, sort of. Which is very interesting to me, because in the final game, we see that the rest of the group is a little apprehensive about everything, with the exception of maybe Manny. Ultimately, I think what they did was the best way to kill off Joel, rather than, this sort of slow, everybody gets their stab in kind of way, but that's just me. So that has been the cut content of The Last of Us Part 2. I hope you enjoy it. I hope you've liked both of these videos, and if you haven't seen my video on the first game, please just check my channel. I uploaded that last week. So thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I hope you have a good morning or evening or, whatever.